Welcome to this seminar on planning for Brexit, cost and cash management. I'm Andrew Webb, I'm Grant Thornton's Chief Economist, and I'm going to give an overview of economic context and some local economic performance. And my colleague Richard Martin is going to talk around cash management. In this session, I want to discuss with you the performance of the Northern Ireland economy. And within this session, I'll discuss how the economy has shown improvement over a number of years since the crash, but that a number of concerns persist. Unlike the rest of the UK, the Northern Ireland economy has yet to recover to its position prior to the financial crisis, and there are concerning gaps with the UK on many fronts. Notwithstanding the strong labour market performance, we still have significant challenges around inactivity rates, lower productivity, and those are issues that are acting as a general and more consistent drag on the economy of Northern Ireland and our competitiveness as we move into a post-Brexit world. Within all that, though, we do have the key issue of Brexit, and surprising as it might be to have to define Brexit at this point after so many years, it's always useful just to, suppose, take stock as to where we are and what we're dealing with. So, as we all know, Brexit is the process of leaving the EU, but there are some subtleties behind that in terms of how we transition, when we transition. As it stands, the transition period is up to 31st December 2020, and by that stage the expectation and the hope might be that we would have a new trading relationship with the EU, including new customs arrangements. The leaving of the European Union allows the United Kingdom to develop new trade relationships with third countries and move into a different trading environment, not just with the European Union, but able to strike out and strike new deals with the rest of the world. Other issues as part of the Brexit process are obviously the removal and replacement of EU programmes and structural funds, and those things that have invested in the likes of university research and lots of infrastructure projects over the last decades. And so there are big challenges and thought processes required as to how those are addressed and how those are replaced. The timeline for Brexit is, to the best of our knowledge, in this flow chart, and we would caveat pretty much anything we say in Brexit terms with regards to it could change overnight or it could change within hours. So to the best of our knowledge, this is the process as we understand it. Obviously there's the potential deal that Prime Minister Johnson has brought back from the EU summit this week, and at the time of recording, Parliament is sitting in the coming days to vote on that. The timeline following that then would be that there's a process of transition that would lead to 2020, and by then there would be hopefully potentially a more consistent and a more firm set of trading arrangements with the EU. To move on, though, to give a bit of a broader context as to where the economy is and how the economy is performing, this slide really drives home for us the key issues around where we are on a global economy context. And we discussed this in terms of what was a relatively calm global environment, turning to one of much more chaotic and much more uncertain times. To explain this a little bit, the dotted line you can see there, just over 100, was the average of uncertainty in the global policy context in the whole decade 2000-2010. And you can see that we're significantly ahead of that and significantly more spiky in terms of how we are viewing policy uncertainty. To explain a little bit about what world uncertainty is, the IMF and Stanford have worked together to really trawl the Economist Intelligence Unit sources of writings on various countries' economic performance and policy and look for phrases relating to uncertainty, and that they've generated this index off the back of that to give some comfort that it's not just a spiky line on a graph. They've also run regressions to plot this and see, is there a relationship between their definition of world uncertainty and global economic performance, and the conclusion is that there is a strong link, so that when we see spikes in global uncertainty, we also then see a downturn in global investment levels, and we're seeing that already in the global economy, and that's leading to more and more uncertainty both from business community, and we're seeing more and more uncertainty from the consumer sector as well. Having painted a very bleak picture of global uncertainty, I would like to move on just to, I suppose, bring some positivity to the context, because in the face of all that uncertainty, Northern Ireland's economic performance has been particularly resilient. This graph shows Northern Ireland's composite economic performance, or in more simple terms, GDP, versus the performance of both Ireland and the rest of the UK. You can see that the Northern Ireland index in deep purple there has continued to demonstrate growth over the last number of quarters and is averaging about 1.6% over the last number of quarters, and has had a consistent growth over the last 6 quarters, which is more than the other 2 comparators there can lay claim to. Obviously, though, you can see a very strong growth in the Republic of Ireland, and that has been driven by very strong export growth and very strong consumer trends. Northern Ireland's performance, while impressive on an output, while impressive and is growing, obviously very far off the pace there. So when we think about where we're heading next in economic terms, it's a very different path that we're heading into in the next decade compared to the one we've just experienced. Northern Ireland has had a very strong labour market in the last number of years. In fact, since the trough in around 2012 after the crash, Northern Ireland's added about 85 to 90,000 extra jobs to the labour market. So a really strong performance, and you can see that across various sectors there in the orange bars on that graph. The purple bars are where we expect the labour market to perform over the next decade. So as you can tell, looking at that, you can see that there was significant growth in what we term the recovery phase since 2012, particularly across sectors such as health, partly driven by an ageing population and more demands on the health service, but also strong growth across the private sector, in manufacturing, in professional and scientific type activities and administrative support type activities. To, I suppose, explain what those sectors are in more day-to-day terms, those would be the sectors such as consultancy houses, ICT, cybersecurity type jobs that Belfast shown particular strength in, coming through quite strongly in the numbers there. Manufacturing is a very interesting one and a very impressive performance for Northern Ireland, because I suppose there's a perception in the market and maybe in the media that some of the bigger manufacturing firms and the closures they've experienced might lead to a sense that it's a particularly tough time for manufacturing. And while there are certain very uncertain times ahead for the sector, it has come from a period of significant growth and is a major contributor to Northern Ireland's economic performance. And there's a very dynamic bed and cohort of smaller manufacturing businesses that are driving a lot of that growth, but we are seeing those very unfortunate headlines for some of the bigger manufacturers coming through in terms of redundancy announcements. Over the next decade, the sectoral strengths are expected to remain, but as we said, there's a much reduced scale of new employment coming through on the labour market. So we expect about 35 to 40,000 jobs between now and over the next 10 years. In terms of GDP growth, we're expecting that to come in at around 1.3% this year, 1.2% next year, and 1.2% in 2021. But I would again just caveat all of this in the context of we're not yet certain as to what path Brexit's going to take. So having looked at where we expect the labour market to go based on best estimations of employment and sectoral growth, we do see a number of different paths, obviously, for what Brexit might look like. And this slide sets out a range of possible new relationships that the UK has been and could seek with the EU in various discussions. In essence, the further to the left, the closer the relationship and the least disruption. To the right, the more disruption but greater autonomy for the UK. So where we ultimately land really is part of the ongoing discussions and will be hopefully becoming clearer in the next number of years. The government's aim, we believe, is for a relatively detached relationship with the EU, as indicated by the red outlined FTA box. Labour's view is that they support the membership of a customs union, but there's probably parliamentary support for the softest of Brexit options, which would be an economic area plus a customs union. So all to play for, and currently a lack of clarity as to where any of this will land, given what we all know around how the House of Commons has been voting and how the government's position has had to move just to try and get something through. And as various bills pass through Parliament, the ability for government to negotiate could tie their hands as we move forward. In terms of different growth scenarios and the impacts that these various paths for Brexit might have, there's a range of scenarios that discuss just how different the future prospects for the UK economy will be. And even in I suppose a softer Brexit, we're looking at a downturn, or an estimated downturn, or an estimated reduction in growth, probably more accurate to say, of around 2%. And in a harder Brexit, if you like, or a WTO rules type Brexit, we're talking about being worse off to the tune of 9% versus where we might have otherwise been had we not chosen to leave the EU. Sterling is something that gives cause for much thought in terms of Northern Ireland's position and where we're headed with Brexit and what the path might be for sterling. So there's been a lot of interest in the path that sterling has taken and will take, and you can see on that slide there the drop in sterling just after the result of the election. And you can also see how that hasn't recovered to that level since. It has been quite volatile and does tend to react depending on which news item emerges and which deal seems to emerge and how Parliament behaves. So sterling is acting as a bellwether in terms of where we're heading with Brexit, but as I said, hasn't recovered back to anything like the levels of the pre-EU referendum. And what might that mean? Well, a weaker sterling has traditionally been seen as a good thing for exporters and a bad thing for importers. And the structure of the NI economy and our exporting and importing patterns means that that's a reasonably simplistic analysis which doesn't capture the full intricacies of an all-island trade situation that we currently operate within and currently enjoy. And just to unpick that a little bit, just over half of Northern Ireland exporters also import, and so it's difficult to be definitive about the impact on NI exporters in terms of a downturn in sterling, as it will also depend on increased cost of goods and the various services that they have to import and the extent of their importing activity, and just what the balance would therefore be between how they engage with the domestic UK market and how they engage with export markets. So depreciation in the value of sterling would also make household goods imported into NI more expensive, and those are numerous. Over time, this could result in higher rates of inflation, or if such rises are not tolerable and not able to be passed on to the consumer, that sort of inflation then could lead to a monetary policy activity that could impact on interest rates. Again, I suppose we can't caveat enough just the extent to which we're in an uncertain period. So these are all possible scenarios, and I suppose we think about it in a no-deal situation, and anything better than a no-deal situation obviously mitigates some of this more bleak assessment of where we could end up. Just on sterling, and to continue a thought around where spending patterns and households might be impacted. Northern Ireland's been relatively more affected by inflation compared to other UK regions in the last number of years, based on analysis by the Department for the Economy, and that's really because NI households spend relatively more of their incomes on food, clothing and fuel, and they're broadly imported. So those key elements that Northern Ireland consumers spend on are more exposed, if you like, to the vagaries of a sterling exchange rate depreciation or appreciation. Also tourism, often when we hear of a depreciation in sterling, we start to see more media around cross-border shopping and a boost to tourism, and those are two key areas for the local economy. Again, it's difficult to be definitive as the past benefits, as to whether or not the past benefits would be replicated in a no-deal context. Given that pressure on NI household spending power that I mentioned, that also may mean that the traditional benefits of increased UK households holidaying within the UK may not materialise. There may be a contraction that's UK-wide if there's an impact on sterling. And while Depreciation of sterling could increase the number of Irish residents shopping in NI. It could also be complicated by potential cost increases of imported goods in NI and uncertainty around customs and VAT requirements when bringing goods back over the border. In addition, for migrant workers, which have been key to some of Northern Ireland's sectors, particularly the hospitality sector, the depreciation of sterling could impact on the attractiveness of taking up employment opportunities in Northern Ireland. And we have seen some evidence of that, where some key sectors have really struggled to find the labour sources that they would have previously relied on from outside Northern Ireland. So the extent to which EU26 migrants are working in Northern Ireland has been impacted already by this decline in sterling and could be compounded further under a no-deal scenario. On trade, and moving on to just the potential impacts on trade, Northern Ireland purchases and sells more to GB than any other destination, and there's been lots of discussion during the course of the Brexit negotiations just about the various flows of trade between Northern Ireland and GB and Northern Ireland and ROI. In 2017, GB sales in goods amounted to close to 8 billion, just under 8 billion at 7.6, and it was 10.5 billion in purchases from GB. With regards to the purchases and sale of services, 3.7 billion in service sales and 2.8 billion in service purchases. So the GB market is crucial to Northern Ireland. NISRA estimates that of the 7.6 billion of goods sold to GB, which excludes farming, 29% were manufactured agri-food products, and the majority at 71% were in other manufactured products. In terms of the 3.7 billion in services sold to GB, 45% were in construction and a significant proportion in transport. So a large proportion of the value of Northern Ireland's goods and services go to GB, and a lot of that can be attributed to a small number of businesses, about 169 businesses engaged in that, which are accounting for about 40% of that trade flow. Ireland is Northern Ireland's biggest export destination and an important first market for exporters, and a key policy challenge for Northern Ireland is to try and get more companies exporting, and gravity models would suggest that you do more trade with your nearest neighbours, so the Irish market is a particularly crucial one for lots of traders, but also the policy ambition to grow Northern Ireland's export base and get people operating in external markets. In 2017, total exports of goods and services to Ireland were valued at 3.9 billion, and that's 39% of all exports. It's food and live animals which are the top goods that are exported to Ireland, and that's worth about 32% or 1 billion of total Northern Ireland good exports to Ireland. Services exports to Ireland increased by 28% since 2016, and they're just shy of 1 billion at this point. And approximately 44% of those services are sent to Ireland, and it continues to be Northern Ireland's largest service export market. The Irish market is also an important destination for agri-food. For food and drinks processors, it's the largest export market, accounting for more than half of the exports. For the farming sector, exports to Ireland totaled 61 million. And to delve into that a little bit, sheep slaughter alone totaled nearly 35 million. Just to give a sense of just how important those sectors are and the all-island economy. Almost 8,700 businesses in Northern Ireland sold goods and services to Ireland in 2017, and many of those were micro businesses who employ 0 to 9 employees. They accounted for 2/3 of the businesses exporting to Ireland. So there's a significant challenge there in terms of the markets that Northern Ireland plays into, both in GB and ROI. And in a no-deal scenario, the difficulties in trading, based on analysis, have estimated that there could be 40,000 jobs at risk from a no-deal Brexit. Now that analysis, when you put that in the context of we're expecting additional jobs in the next decade to be around 40,000, if there's a no-deal Brexit, you could then be talking about no growth or a downturn in the labour market and a proper downturn, recession territory in the economy. So the impact of EU tariffs could reduce Northern Ireland's exports to Ireland by 11% based on that same analysis by the Department for the Economy. But there's also the impact of non-tariff barriers and extra admin and extra bureaucracy that could also see a decline of 19% in Northern Ireland's exports, and just the additional burden of doing that might put a lot of people off. And also you can get into issues of origin, certificates of origin, and how that works through the supply chain is potentially a significant impact. So no deal therefore places a twin pressure on Northern Ireland's access to the EU and the UK markets, leaving businesses with very limited options, and the NI economy facing potentially an absolute reduction in exports and external sales under what we're calling the no deal scenario here. Tradable services we see as similarly exposed. Businesses exporting services to Ireland would face an average increase in the cost of doing business of just shy of 15 percentage points. And that's particularly vulnerable when we think about where we've driven our economy to in the last number of years, particularly ICT and, as I said, cybersecurity, and those have been key growth sectors. They're tasked with, I suppose, growing the Northern Ireland economy and driving us towards a more productive economy, and the potential downturn in performance there could be significant. And then under a no-deal scenario, Northern Ireland's FDI attractiveness would be very much negatively impacted, and there's been great successes in being able to attract inward investment over the last number of years. So on the basis of Department for the Economy analysis and on the basis of what we've gleaned from potential impacts in terms of additional bureaucracy and tariffs and the imposition of those, we could see that a significant potential downturn from those various impositions on business.
Over the next few slides, we're going to run through how Brexit may impact on the cash cycle of businesses and ways in which businesses can prepare to deal with the impact on cash. Brexit will lead to cost increases in many businesses, so it's important for companies to start thinking about what they can do to reduce costs and how they can cope with cash flow challenges, perhaps due to delays in the supply chain or problems recovering cash from customers. Businesses don't typically fail from a lack of profit, they fail from a lack of cash, so it's vital for businesses not to underestimate this and to keep on top of their cash position. Many companies are so focused on creating profits that they neglect what's actually in their bank account to meet liabilities as they fall due. This will be particularly important for businesses which are already tight for cash headroom. However, it's good practice for any business to have a handle on their cash status to avoid unnecessary leakages. Firstly, let's consider what a no-deal scenario may look like. We can expect to see increased volatility in financial markets as we approach Brexit, as they react to updates and negotiations in different ways. In the event that the UK leaves the EU without a deal, we can expect the pound to fall, with economists predicting up to as much as a 15% reduction in its value. Interest rates. Interest rates may rise or fall depending on the perceived impact, with Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, stating that the appropriate monetary policy response is not automatic and will depend on the balance of the effects on the demand, supply and the exchange rate. Bank of England stress tests have modelled a rise in base rate to 4%. Institute for Fiscal Studies have forecast base rate cuts to near zero. Foreign exchange movements. In the event of no deal, the pound is expected to depreciate against major currencies. Forecasts vary dramatically from 91 pence to £1.21 to the dollar. European funding streams. Post-Brexit, UK organisations would be unable to access EU funding streams. However, the Chancellor announced that the government will guarantee EU projects agreed before Brexit to provide more certainty for UK organisations over the course of EU exit. This guarantee ensures that UK organisations will continue to receive funding over a project's lifetime if they successfully bid into EU-funded programmes before the end of 2020. What UK policies will replace these mechanisms beyond the guarantee periods is less clear, with government currently consulting on options. Cumulative cost increases. Brexit may cause price and cost rises across the organisation. Margins may be eroded by changes to currency values, the introduction of tariffs and rising labour costs. While each may be small, taken together, the impact could reduce the viability of an organisation. And cash flow disruption. Delays or distress in the supply chain may lead to problems in recovering cash from customers, putting pressure on your cash flow position. As some of these will be outside the control of business, it will be important to recognise the potential impacts such that the business can prepare under various scenarios. So what things should businesses be considering in relation to their cash management? How could Brexit impact your working capital and cash flow? And what are the delays to converting cash? Working capital in a business is the capital used for its day-to-day trading operations, typically including stock, trade and other debtors, less trade creditors and other creditors. A business with a positive working capital position will need to fund this through cash, and any further increases in the net working capital position of a company will bring a further cash drain on the business. Owners and management should consider what impact Brexit will bring for them. For example, is stock likely to increase as a result of price increases being passed on, or will trade debtors increase due to customers delaying payment, perhaps to manage their own cash flow issues? Is there likely to be an increase in bad debts if there is a risk of business failures in the customer base? Business should be prepared for the negative cash impact of movements in their working capital so that they can manage the position going forward. Are you dependent upon EU funding programmes? And if so, how might these change? Many businesses in the UK receive funding via EU regulated programmes, and in some cases may receive significant amounts which have been required for the viability of the business. Businesses should investigate how such funds will be impacted going forward. It will be important to know exactly when funding may cease, and is there likely to be UK government funding to replace this in the short to medium term. Any amendment to timing of funding should be factored into the cash forecasts, particularly for businesses with little cash headroom. How exposed are you to exchange rate and interest rate changes? As noted earlier, there is likely to be volatility in exchange rates and interest rates in the lead up to and post-Brexit. Each business should consider what variations may occur in their cash and cost profile from these fluctuations. For example, a company reliant upon supply in the US, purchasing in dollars, is likely to find the cost of supply increasing. Have you factored Brexit cost increases into new contracts? And what is the level of risk in existing contracts, and is there scope to renegotiate? Entering into new contracts, businesses should be armed with as much knowledge as possible in relation to potential cost increases affecting the contract. Contracts which may seem viable currently could have the potential to be detrimental to the business in the future if the business is unable to pass on cost increases and lock themselves into an unprofitable contract. In addition, businesses should be reviewing their existing contracts to evaluate the potential future cost impact and whether there is any scope for manoeuvre to renegotiate or even to extract themselves from a contract if required. Are you planning to refinance or seek growth capital, and could this be affected by financial market responses to Brexit? Depending on your individual scenario and sector of operations, there may be a change in risk appetite of funders, which could impact, for example, on the interest rates offered. Lenders are already tightening credit and will revise credit risk. This should be considered by a business when considering if the timing is right to refinance or to include in assessing their repayment ability in cash forecasts. Do your investors understand your Brexit risks and opportunities? Investors will want to ensure that the business has given due consideration to all risks and opportunities available to them to underpin confidence in the business plans. Future funding from new and existing investors is likely to depend on their perception of the management team and its ability to forecast accurately and deliver the strategic plan. So what steps can businesses take to aid their cost and cash management? Insulate your balance sheet. A robust balance sheet can shield against any harmful trading performance impacts. It also provides flexibility to seize unforeseen opportunities. So what do we mean by that? It's important to ensure that you have enough liquidity in your balance sheet by reviewing and optimising working capital performance, exploring alternative sources of finance, and reviewing hedging positions. In relation to optimising working capital, it's important for businesses to monitor their debtor and creditor days in particular. Does the business have a dedicated credit control resource to ensure that receipts from customers are being obtained in a timely manner? Often, businesses can have difficulty in recovering cash from its customer base, particularly under tricky economic conditions currently being experienced. Whilst it's not always possible for small businesses to have a specific credit controller, it is worth putting in the time to chase cash receipts to reduce the working capital requirement of the business. Customers may have a tendency to wait until the supplier comes looking for payment, which can lead to slippage in debtor days if not monitored. On the flip side, businesses should consider whether they are making the most of their credit terms offered by suppliers. Stretching creditor days will reduce the required level of working capital in the business, with a resulting positive impact on cash. However, care must be taken to ensure that supplier relationships are not damaged by delaying payments for too long beyond agreed limits. This can be particularly important for key suppliers, which are of strategic importance to the business. If discounts are being offered by suppliers, management should weigh up the benefits of reduced costs against making quicker payments. It may not always be beneficial to chase discounted deals when it will have a negative impact on the cash cycle. Engagement with your suppliers and customers can be key. Agree a joint plan where possible to help each other. As well as debtors and creditors, stock management and strategy should be reviewed to ensure appropriate levels of inventory are held. Whilst we have heard many instances of businesses increasing their stock holding ahead of Brexit to mitigate against potential future price increases, this strategy may not be suitable for all. There will be an increase in working capital and subsequent cash reduction from holding excess levels of stock, as well as potential increase in storage costs. These should be considered against any future cost savings. Explore alternative sources of finance. In recent years, there has been a huge rise in the number of alternate lending providers. However, many businesses continue to rely on traditional bank finance once they've identified a finance need. There are many options for businesses to explore depending on the nature of the funding requirement. For example, leasing or hire purchase, where security is granted over a specific asset with a cash deposit paid. Rather than paying for capital expenditure directly out of cash, businesses may achieve cash flow benefit from spreading the cost secured against the asset. Funding for working capital assets using overdraft or invoice discounting, which are usually charged against specific asset groups. Invoice discounting can be a vital source of cash borrowed against the strength of the debtor book. There are also leveraged loans, which sit behind senior debt, mezzanine debt products, which are typically unsecured and are therefore higher risk and increased cost, but can be an important top-up finance with flexibility in terms of repayment pattern, and also venture capital or private equity. There are multiple finance providers under each of these finance sources which can enable businesses to obtain the short-term or long-term funding they require. Reviewing hedging positions. Businesses should ensure that they make the most out of natural hedging positions where possible. For example, matching cash receipts in dollars against cash purchases in dollars to minimise the impact from exchange rate volatility. Where natural hedging is not possible, businesses may want to explore hedging options with their bank. In one recent client example, our client was required to make a significant investment in capital expenditure in euros. Whilst the deposit was paid at the current rate, the future payment on delivery of the machine was hedged via a forward contract. This has helped the business with its future cash flow forecasting by providing certainty over the price to be paid. Reduce your cost base. Businesses should be consistently reviewing their current operating model to identify any efficiencies. This will be particularly important as a result of Brexit. Management should be in the habit of prioritising areas of greatest opportunity to reduce cost and to improve value. Creating an environment of lean cost structure by producing and monitoring timely management information will help to reduce the cost base by restricting non-value added activities. Alternative sources of supply should be explored. particularly for supplies which are more likely to be impacted by tariffs or currency fluctuations. Suppliers that may previously have been more expensive may become the cheaper option. Stop or decrease discretionary spend. An important aspect of cash management is the monitoring of discretionary spend. Management should be considering whether costs are absolutely necessary for the success of the business. For example, investment in specific capital expenditure may be desired, but could be delayed to help cash flow by making repairs to older machinery in the short term. Preempt cash flow challenges. One of the most important elements for management to concentrate on in times of volatility or restricted cash headroom is the ability to identify a cash flow issue in advance of the issue arising. In order to do this effectively, the business should review and strengthen their cash flow forecasting processes and assumptions. Clear thought needs to be given to how the assumptions are put together and to have a real understanding of the potential impact should there be a variation in these key assumptions. Should it be required, short-term cash flow reporting should be considered, which could be weekly or even daily to enable management to get a handle over their cash position. Cash flow forecasts should be updated regularly to remain viable, and management should be monitoring actual performance against budget to enable improvements to be made in future forecasting. In addition, scenario planning should be carried out by running sensitivities on the forecast. For example, by implementing cost increases or stretching debtor days to give an indication of potential future issues should performance not match expectation. Monitoring debt and covenants. It's important to understand the impact of the cash flow projections on debt and bank covenants. Should the projections indicate a potential breach of covenants, the business should look to implement some of the factors discussed previously to mitigate against the breach. If this is not possible, lenders should be informed of the potential issue, as it's important to keep a dialogue and relationship with the lender. This will allow for discussion about what other initiatives can be considered to prevent future breaches. And finally, engage with policy makers. If you are dependent upon EU funding programmes, you should consider how policymakers can help shape policy on possible future participation and prospects of the UK continuing similar funding. So hopefully that's given you a few practical tips on how to better manage your cash. Thanks for listening.